So thank you everyone for being here. There's nothing that I like talking about more than governance. I've served on a lot of boards myself, and first of all, a big thank you to all of you who are board members. I know what a huge commitment it is, and our schools be where they are without your help, so thank you very much. So I hope this is interactive. I have a lot of material here, which hopefully I'll be able to cover. But if you have a question, particularly a clarifying question, I'll be watching the chat screen, and we'll certainly pause to clarify anything that I can. If we run out of time and we can't answer all the questions, I will actually get copy of all of those and make sure that I answer them. So please be assured if we don't get everything done in an hour, I'll answer your question, or you can always contact me. My email is orem@nais.org. So today what we're going to do is really talk about the changing landscape of education and what that means for boards. And to set the stage a little bit before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I really want to start with an interesting look at change. And this particular video has nothing really to do with the education world, but it's an opportunity to look at change backwards. So without further ado, let's set the stage by looking at this. I hope you enjoyed that little trip down memory lane. The point of that is, if we could live life backwards and certainly see some of these trends and changes, we would certainly be a lot more prophetic about what we do, but we can't. And how does that apply to governance? My feeling today is there's so much change in the education landscape that we really have a very difficult time staying on top of things, making decisions, and really understanding how we serve our schools best. So what I'm going to try to get at today is some of the things that you should be following as a board. If you get into the process of collecting data, collecting information, you will find that you are more equipped on a regular basis to answer key questions. So I'm going to quickly go through 10 areas of data that you should be really looking at, or 10 kinds of information that your board should be looking at, and why these are important. And number one is your own school trends. Certainly a lot of schools do this, and there are many different ways. You can be looking at ratings or benchmarks or percentages. Most of us do this. We look at enrollment numbers and fundraising numbers, and that's really all very useful. But what really becomes much more useful is when you look at it in context. And what I mean by that is certainly when we're looking at enrollment numbers, for example, looking at those numbers in context of schools that we look at as our peer schools or like schools in the country, we get a much better sense of, are we doing better or worse? Are there problems that are distinctively ours? Are everyone facing demographic issues? So adding context to your measures really helps you to see the world somewhat differently. And one of the best ways to do this, if you're not now doing it as a board, is to set up a dashboard. And not every board will want to look at the same types of items, and there may be some that are more key for you. But if you are not now doing this, there's some easy ways to do this through NAIS, but also, certainly through Excel. We currently have dashboards in 41 areas that you can take a look at and understand, dashboard your admissions figures or your endowment or tuition or any of those sorts of things. So that can be a very useful tool for boards in really understanding how their own performance is vis-a-vis other schools within the industry. And as I mentioned, context adds everything. And one of the things you can do in our dashboard certainly is compare yourselves to other schools within the state, other types of schools, or probably the most useful is setting up your own group. If there are 6 or 7 schools that you like to benchmark against, you can set up these groups within Dazzle, which is our dashboarding program. It stands for Data and Analysis for School Leadership. And you can certainly start to get that information very easily. As long as your school gives information to us, which many schools are doing right now, you can actually get this information out very easily. But it's a very easy way to really start looking at your data in a very critical way and to really start bringing up questions, the kinds of things that you should be aware of as you're making decisions. I just wanted to offer, if you are new to using these tools, we offer webinars through Dazzle. And if you want to write to me afterwards to set some kind of training up, or you want to get into the business of doing dashboards for your board, we can certainly help you to do that. Really linked to that certainly is demographic trends, and this is an area that I always tell boards that they should be following. It used to be that demographic trends were very uniform nationally, but today demographic trends change by area to area, and even within your area, particularly if you're a day school and you have always relied on certain zip codes to really bring in all your families, and we see movement all the time. So having a way that your board really follows demographic trends is very important, and for good reason. I have been following what I might call our supply chain for a very long time, and the last few years the birth rate had been dropping. 2012, there was a headline that really got my attention that said that the birth rate in the United States was the lowest in recorded history. And of course, since we certainly rely on kids to be able to have schools, that was bad news. And we're finally starting to see an uptick in that. But, an interesting thing that's really facing us demographically is the recession changed some people's viewpoints about their ability to be able to support a family. And some are deciding to have children much later in life. So following these numbers will be increasingly important so that you can start to project what the situation is going to be like in your area. And I wanted to give you some very, very specific ideas in the New York area what that may look like. This is also from an NAIS resource that you can access. It's our demographic center. And as part of the Demographic Center, we have something called Demographic Snapshot. And basically, what that does is it looks at the demographic and economic viewpoint. So I also see, I have a question, if births are down, how does that affect independent schools? Well, just really the number of school-age children. What we're seeing in some areas of the country is that there are going to be less children projected in the next 5 years than there were beforehand. For those of you who have been studying this for some time, the 1990s was a period of double-digit growth for the school-age population. And so many independent schools had long waiting lists. But now, as we look at the demographics situation across the board, what we're seeing is that some areas of the country, the school-age population might be down as much as 3 or 4%. And although that doesn't tell the story across the board, because you really need to dig down into those figures and understand from, your particular sweet spot as a school, how do those demographic numbers affect you moving forward, which is why I always urge schools to really dig into demographic data. This top line shot, which is I'm showing you right now, this is a metropolitan area. You will see in the top sort of middle, CBSAs is a demographic term for core-based statistical area. But in simple terms, these are metro areas. So in the Albany area, there is a slight increase forecast for the next 5 years in the school-age population. And we also look at things with families and income of 150,000 and above. That's sort of a figure that we've chosen, and it will not be the same in other areas across the country, of what we think, might be the starting point for a family that might be a full pay family. The good news in Albany, as you continue to look down the chart, is that they're projecting that there will be an increase in interest in private schools. So what the demographic snapshot tries to do is to put in one form what the overall metro area looks like. What it doesn't show is, again, as I mentioned, if you're a day school and you've relied on, the majority of your population from a variety of zip codes, what the movement in them might be. So you really want to track that. I'll give you a good example. Where I live in Washington, D.C., there are many independent schools, and they tend to be clustered in various areas. Quite a few of them are in an area that we would refer to as Upper Northwest Washington, D.C. Well, the demographics of that area has changed. Much of it is taken over by baby boomers, who are not leaving their homes, staying in their homes longer. The housing market has been quite strong here. So there's been a little bit of an exodus. So a lot of the growth in the school-age population is in the far-flung suburbs. So it's important to really watch that for your own school to understand where those changes might be and how you want to really respond. A good example of that, there's a school in Baltimore, Maryland, the board started studying demographics very early. And they started to see these patterns that most of the school-age population was really moving a little bit more distant from the school. So before any other school did this, they actually hopped on a bus program that was really going pretty far away to some suburbs where they didn't actually have a lot of penetration early on, but they actually as ended up kind of owning the market before other schools got in there, because they'd established these buses. They were bringing in kids from farther away because they knew they needed to have a larger recruiting area to sustain them. We'll take another look. This is the Buffalo area. These numbers are not quite as strong for the school-age population. They're going to be a very small increase. And the projection here for the next 5 years is there's probably going to be a decrease in interest in private schools within that population. So certainly for schools in this area, you're going to want to study those numbers and say, what does this mean? How are we going to approach this? Here's New York City, the metropolitan area, and these numbers are pretty strong. Historically, we have not seen New York City as a place that struggled getting kids to enroll in schools, but you never know how that's going to change, because there's really two factors here, and that's supply and demand. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But if we have the kids and the kids are and the families are interested in private schools, that's certainly good news. But we're really seeing some changing trends in consumer values, and that actually is going to have probably a really profound impact moving forward. Certainly, a huge in this too is economic trends. What are we seeing that families are, their capacity to pay? What does disposable income look like? So for boards, in terms of following trends, certainly some of the things you want to look at are industry trends. Even though you're not experiencing them right now, what are other schools seeing? Because sometimes, we can start to investigate by looking what's at someone else's door. So, we're seeing for both day and boarding schools across the country, that yield rates are softening. Some schools may be full, but they may be digging deeper into their pools to actually find kids, while some schools are really struggling and they have trouble filling their seats. For many, there's been a growth in investment in financial aid. They find to actually keep current families or to meet need that there's more of an investment in financial aid dollars. This can often be a really tough conversation for the board as you go to approve that budget every year and you try to decide what is the investment that we should make in financial aid, what goals are we trying to reach through financial aid investment. So, these are some of the things that you certainly want to watch. Also keeping a good eye on what's happening in the area and how that might affect people's ability to afford independent school. New York, as we all know, has huge strengths. It can be a very expensive place to live, and so that can affect people's disposable income. But there are certainly booms in certain economies. It's the financial capital of the U.S., so lots of those companies are drawn there. And but what you don't know, and you certainly need to watch out for, are those trends. For example, something that we saw during the recession is areas that where schools really dependent upon families from typical type of industries. When those industries moved out of the area, they found that a lot of their base was gone. So you certainly want to keep your eye on local economic performance, what's happening in the housing market, to really understand, how other pressures might affect families' ability to afford an independent school. And one of my favorite places to actually get research, and I certainly encourage all boards to take a look at this, is the Pew Research Center. It does an amazing number of studies which are available free, and a lot of them are studies about how people feel about certain things. So since the recession, they've spent a lot of time looking at personal finances, and so every year I go to look at these indicators to see how they've changed. But generally, people are not as optimistic, even though they may still be doing quite well financially. And I think it's because certainly the recession shook some people's faith. And, one of the things that we've seen in a lot of the parent surveys that we do is families looking at K through 12 education get nervous about making a commitment for that 12 or 13 years. And so we see some families choosing, whether it be elementary school, middle, or high school, sometimes they decide, this is the entry point that they want. So you certainly want to understand the nuances of your particular community and to keep an eye on how that's changing. I often encourage schools to do ongoing parent surveys. And the more you do those, the more you can see some changes in attitudes within your own community. And these consumer trends are really key because they go hand in glove. And some of the things that we're seeing are these bullets. And one of the ones that I love to talk about, because we're seeing it more and more, is that bullet number 3 of families wanting to date before committing. And I think, what we're seeing there is that it's a big commitment in independent school tuition. So there's more interest in maybe starting with a summer program or some other way to really get to know the school before they commit and really want to become part of the family. So understanding that, I think, and how the consumer behavior works can be really important, because you may want to have programs that really bring families in. And in fact, I was working with one of my colleagues today for a presentation that we're doing at the NAIS annual conference next week, and it was on non-tuition revenue. And we were looking at some really good models, and there's a school in the Midwest who has this huge wedding business, and it's been, a huge driver of additional income. They have a beautiful campus, but they actually really have put a lot of money into growing this very lucrative business. But we were saying, not only is it a business, but what a great time to actually acquaint families with your school when they first get married and start to think, wow, I love this place. I want my kids to go here. So, seeing all the ways that you can expose families is really a great idea.
Donna, real quick, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat box from Steve.
About the financial aid?
Yep.
That is kind of a complicated question, and I think I'm going to actually get back to you on a complete answer to that, and to involve my colleague Mark Mitchell, who really studies financial aid. And I'm going to send you a little bit of background, which I'm happy to share with everyone else, because the financial aid picture, which our SSS program tracks in greater detail, can give you a very, very well-rounded picture. So Mark also has a really good PowerPoint that really sort of summarizes all of the trends in this area and the impact. So I'm happy to share that as well. So some other things that we're seeing with consumers is we did a study. One of the things we really wanted to find out is, with so much competition in the landscape today, we see charter schools coming on board and other kinds of schools that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And one thing that we really wanted to understand is, how does the presence of all these other types of schools affect families who used to just consider a private school? How does it affect their decision-making process? And so we did a study where we tried to ferret out a group of families across the U.S. We did this with an outside research firm to really follow families who were considering independent schools through the thought process. And one of the things we really wanted to understand was what mattered the most to them and how much were they willing to pay for it. And although this will be different in different parts of the country, this was very much a national study. Certainly what we found out is those items that are in the highlighted box, like teacher quality, character education, preparation for success, schools that are socioeconomically diverse. These are things that families were looking for, but the amount that they were willing to pay for it, we found that many families were dropping out. And it wasn't necessarily driven by their ability to pay. Sometimes it was driven by what else was in that particular community. Some of it was driven by a value system where they said, I think this school is worthwhile at this price point. I just don't see the value at this price point. And so one of the things is we do these metropolitan studies as well. And in some markets, we are seeing that price is really becoming the driver like it never was before. Usually families, when we would say, what is most important to you, and we would look at expense, that was pretty far down on the list. But now in some communities, we're seeing it is a driver, and particularly with younger families. And So to some degree, we're seeing a lot of entrepreneurs enter on the scene and some other options coming up. One of the things that's really prominent is the rise of DIY education. And there was an article about this not too long ago that more recent than actually this one here that actually describes the DIY concept. It said a lot of families from high-tech companies were going this route for their kids. They know technology well. They like the idea of putting together a number of different components for their kids' education. So, you know, they may look at a local charter school or a public school that they think is good. They may then supplement it with tutors. Those tutors may come from a local independent school so that they can really have a one-to-one experience for their child. They may supplement that with online schools like Khan Academy, and but you know, they're finding that they can pull things together, and at a price point that they're more willing to spend, they can educate their child. So, you know, and that's a growing trend, and I think one that will continue to grow. A piece that has really intrigued me, though, and we're about to do some more research on this, is you know, a book that I read not too long ago called 113 Million Markets of One. And what intrigued me about this book, which I read after I watched the video, which this is actually from the video, the piece that I have up right now. I think it's in Vimeo. And it talks about a research project that was done around the world to look at why some companies actually thrived during the recession at a time when the conventional wisdom was that people were saving, they were afraid of spending, and they did this major study which they tried to disrupt in a number of ways. And what they discovered is that consumers, and I know we don't like to use that word in education, but I think, you know, when we look at particularly even younger families, they do have sort of a consumeristic viewpoint when they look at schools. And one of the things that they found is that consumers are so different today, you could take them and put them on two different planets in terms of how they make choices. And the one with the tie and suit on, these are kind of like the Apple and Mac ads that used to be on TV, are called the traditionalists. And what they found is this was the group that we felt had become the dominant group since the recession. People who were saving, they were more conservative about their expenditures. And so these people very much are driven by price. And what's hard with this particular group is if you are the second or third cheapest in a market, you know, that's probably not going to win the hearts and minds of traditionalists because they're looking for similar value at the cheapest price. But what they found was that there's this whole other group of people rising up that they call the NEOs, which stands for New Economic Order. What really got my attention is what they found is that NEOs account for 77% of all spending in the parts of the world, including the US, that they did this study. And what they found with the NEOs is that they had very different drivers in terms of how they make decisions. They were looking for experiences that are very individualistic, that are authentic, that really embrace their value system. And so we're so intrigued by this. The guy who did the research is actually an Aussie and is coming to the US in April. And he's agreed to meet with us. They have a huge data set to really actually explore how independent schools might make sure that they are appealing to this particular group of people. So, you know, I will certainly share that. But, you know, understanding this, it doesn't mean certainly as a board when you're looking at the school that you should alter your mission. It's more about how you ensure that your message is really speaking to people in a way that they value. The other thing that's changing, which is really interesting, is we have a new generation of kids. Roughly Gen Z started about 2000 or 2001, so these kids are in our school right now. And, when you look at, how the school really embraces that student population, the one thing that's really interesting about Gen Z is that they are kids that are really looking for multicultural settings. So they really prize schools that actually really have at its center those kinds of benefits and opportunities. An interesting thing about them, though, that we're watching is that these kids often grew up during the recession and saw how, a strain on resources impacted families. So they're very concerned about money, and are also pessimistic. They've grown up at a tough time. So all of that actually molds together, and when you think about serving these kids well, they present a little bit differently than Gen Y and Gen X before them. So certainly as we get to know more about them, that issues like student wellness, stress, all of those become big drivers in school as well. And, just following this information and understanding that population is changing is really important for boards to be aware of. Although, the head of the school is going to be doing more of the heavy lifting in this arena, the board is making budget decisions, and you certainly want to have the context of which schools exist today to understand that you are allocating resources in the way that is most going to help the school. A big area also for boards is really understanding how they keep philanthropy healthy, and they drive that. Boards are really responsible for really being the leaders in the school, the lead cheerleaders for fundraising. And this is one of the areas where I think we're going to see the biggest change. And it's something certainly that you want to keep aware of. And you want to follow these trends. And these are, I think, some of the dashboards that you should be looking at, not only giving trends, but you need to be looking at how particular social media is really affecting giving. Blackbaud just came out about a week ago with its giving trends for 2014. You can actually go to their website and download that. But one of the key features in this report is this is the year that they really are seeing online giving taking off, that people are really changing the way that they give, and they see online giving, particularly in education, really rising. Also that online donations across the board and all kinds of fundraising are going up, and education was one of the biggest benefactors. One of the really terrific pieces of information in giving overall is the forecast had been that it was probably going to be 2018 or 19 before we saw giving return to its pre-recession levels. And this year, it's actually returned to those levels. So, and as I said, education is one of the strongest areas. So that's just really good news. There's lots of other good information, but this report, which Blackbaud puts out every year, is something that certainly a board should be reading and talking about in its own philanthropy circles as well. And as you can see from this, part of the report is they tracked online giving by sectors, and higher ed saw the biggest increases, whereas K through 12 was next in line. So certainly one of the things you want to look at is how online giving is available in your school, and are you making available those kinds of opportunities that will ensure that you're not leaving any money on the table. The other trend that we're seeing is more study and more information about the differences in how people give, whether they be gender, race, age, and there's a lot of information on that. We have a lot of it on our website. We try to incorporate it in our trend book every year. But one of the biggest changes that we've seen recently is, I think, most felt that men were probably bigger givers across the board, but what we saw in a study that was done by the Center on Philanthropy was that actually female households had really, particularly among baby boomers, were some of the biggest givers, and there was a huge growth there. And so I think understanding the differences too, because there are differences in what appeals to people. One of the things that we're seeing across the board in fundraising is that donors want to get much more information about impact. They really want to understand how those dollars are being used, and they want to understand that their money is really making a difference. And so the more transparent you are, the way you involve donors in communities so that they really understand that, the chances are the more loyal they will be. Where we're struggling, though, is millennials, and they have shown to have little loyalty to their alma mater as givers. As I was saying to George and Andrew earlier, it looks like they're spending their money on beer here instead. But I think what they found is that, they're giving to causes. They very much are involved in social media, and they give, to disasters and that sort of thing. But they don't necessarily make the connection that their school is a place that they should invest in. So, one of the things you certainly want to understand is what you can do when there are students at the school. So, a huge trend today is investing in student awareness programs. So when that students graduate from your school, they have a sense of why it's important to give back to that school. And finally, I think, one of the biggest trends that we saw this year was what happened with ALS. And if you, the water bucket challenge or the ice bucket challenge, the amount of money that and awareness that this particular charity raised was astronomical. And so what we are seeing, where there is just a huge shift, is social media is really changing the patterns of giving. And one of the interesting things in the Pew Research Center did a huge study about this, and they found that it wasn't necessarily donative intent that drives this, so it's quite different. And basically, it's wanting to be part of something bigger than yourself. And this is a trend that we're starting to see change the nature of philanthropy. When I was at the CASE NAIS conference a month ago, I went to a session from a company that works with schools to look at that. And they've really extended some of their annual funds hugely by really using social media towards the end of campaign to bring in extra dollars. Phillips Exeter has been hugely successful in this, and a number of other schools are using it quite widely. So this is a trend certainly you want to be aware of, is to ensure that you're taking advantage of social media, you're understanding how giving through social media is different than traditional giving, and how this may shift in the years ahead, and what this means for how you might invest in philanthropy at your school, what kind of infrastructure you need to fund. Again, even though the board is not building the development operation, you need to understand the context of this so that you know that you're funding the right things and that you're asking the right questions. Legal. Now, this is something that will always be on the board's radar. We tend to track everything that's happening, and there's always a new lawsuit of some kind. But certainly a big one is executive compensation. The IRS has really is really after education. Right now they're focused on higher ed and wanting to ensure that anybody that's in a top position, in this case at an independent school, it tends to be the head, perhaps the business officer, but they want to know that you've gone through a process to benchmark that salary. So, we're seeing a lot of action there. Recently for schools that have study abroad programs, there's been some litigation around international travel. And of course, we're all following and worried about how tax reform might threaten the charitable deduction. And the Affordable Care Act is something that you have to be really on top of, because there are new rules out every year. And And that really is imposing all kinds of new regulations, new ways of doing things. So, being on top of what's happening out there is really important for the boards, just to make sure that you've done everything as a board to ensure that your school is in compliance, that you're not doing anything that might put you in dangerous territory. And we actually have a lot of free resources. Our attorney, Deborah Wilson, spends a lot of time working herself and with outside counsel, developing resources around some of the things that are out there, from executive compensation to international travel. Not too long ago, we were in Colorado talking to the schools out there, and they said they've had a host of new, legal issues around marijuana, and how to deal with that. So there's constantly something new, and the more you can stay on top of these industry trends, certainly you can be there prepared to deal with them before they're at your front door. And, I think the education trends, although this is generally not the responsibility of a board, what I suggest is that certainly boards should be steeped in what's happening in the education landscape. So much is really understanding the context on which your school exists today. And there's lots of education trends out there that you want to keep on top of, and certainly ask questions about, what might make sense for your school, how you might take advantage of both these challenges and opportunity. And, certainly a huge one right now is the use of online education or blended learning. And, technology is really pushing the envelope in education as we see more and more online schools arising, particularly in the 9 through 12 space. We're seeing all kinds of things happening there. But we're also seeing schools looking at blended learning and really where there are components that are face-to-face and some are online, and how that may certainly make for a much better or richer experience for kids. Some schools are using online learning to supplement their curriculum where they cannot afford to hire a teacher specifically for a set of courses. They're finding that, by working with a consortium, they might be able to expand their curricular offerings. The online school for girls is one that has been growing in leaps and bounds, and there are more on the landscape every day. The other thing that's very big, too, is corporate America is looking at kids graduating from college and saying that, we're not graduating work-ready kids. And that's actually forced some of them into the marketplace. IBM has launched a series of high schools, and they decide they're going to just educate their own, and that's going to be an interesting trend to follow, as that could be more competition in the market. But one of the things that we're looking at, and this was a study from the conference board on, what kids need to be able to do at various levels to ensure that they are ready for the workforce. And I think an interesting question, certainly for boards is how we attain knowledge and whether or not kids go to college. I mean, certainly is still very accepted, and, the workforce is using that now as a, as a certainly a degree, as an entrant into a lot of jobs. But, some of the forecasts are that that's going to change, and that we're going to be moving more into an environment that is about what skills you possess. And so, a good question is, in this world where everything is changing like that, how does that change the role of independent schools? What might we do differently? How do we want to ensure that, when kids leave our schools, that they actually have those kinds of attributes? Another thing that's really happening is how teachers are using class time. And so, there's a lot of adoption in flipped learning where kids are viewing what would be the traditional lectures that they would see in the classroom at home. With that classroom time being spent more on one-to-one, is looking at those specific challenges that a child had, so that education can be more tailored. So technology is really certainly changing the nature of all of the approach to some of these things, some for the good, some for the bad. It's not all great, but certainly understanding just these trends and having conversations about what this means for your school is really important. Likewise, just in governance, we've seen just a tremendous number of things going on, lots of governance scandals that have been in the news that, really say to boards, how do we really stay on top of these things? How do we make sure that we're not square in the middle of this? And, we actually did some interviews last year with governance experts, and we asked Dick Chait, who's done an enormous amount of research on nonprofit governance, is, what should our school boards learn from this? How do you operate to ensure that you're not in the middle of one of these scandals? And, he said that every board needs to really talk about this, is what is the right place to be where you're not interfering with the head's ability to run the school, but you don't give so much deference so that you don't really understand what's going on. So certainly I think a good conversation to have is, what does that look like? How do you strike that balance to make sure that you really are giving the head and the school administration the room they need to really run the school well and to support them in those efforts? But how you also understand that from a governance point of view, you're asking the right kind of questions so that you're staying ahead of all of this. So, a good conversation, and I certainly would encourage, board chairs and heads to have this conversation to talk about what does this look like in the context of our school. One of the really healthy things that we've seen in our boards is that heads of school and boards seem to be very aligned on what are the issues facing schools. This is from our governance study, which we do every few years, which is on our website. And we do a separate study with board chairs and heads and ask them lots of questions. And, we ask them, what are the top issues facing the school? And pretty much across the board, number one was managing enrollment and keeping the school affordable. Marketing the school right up there, recruiting, retaining, and compensating quality faculty. And you can go through this report and certainly see what other school boards said. But, the key thing is that they really understood the issues. So, I think it's very healthy. But what is an area that I think boards really need to spend some time on is this area of innovation. And this is a really interesting report that was done by Nonprofit Management and Leadership that looked at our nonprofit boards really built for innovation. And basically what they talked about are there are two ways that you can really spur innovation. One is by your board processes, and those processes are have to do with how well you do succession planning, how well you actually ensure that conflict is okay, healthy conflict, that you don't have a board that is just agreeing to everything, but that you're allowing for those kinds of conversations. The other thing they talked about is something that drives innovation is diversity on boards. And although this is not necessarily something that seems natural, but I always encourage boards to look beyond the most obvious candidates for board membership. One of the healthiest things to do is to bring people on outside of the school to actually look at your processes in ways that you can't. A good example, I've been working with a school here that is a school for learning differences. So they're bringing on players from the therapeutic community and to be on the board. But, having these outside voices can often look at the school and offer insights that you can't see. So, certainly how you choose board members, how you build a pipeline is one of the most important things for boards to be thinking about today. And quickly, because I know I want to leave a little bit of time at the end, the workforce is huge. There's so many changes in the workforce, and certainly a healthy school is made up of, great faculty, a great administration. So for boards, it's understanding what those challenges are going to be in the years ahead. And every year I usually look at a number of sources for what the workforce forecast is. And, certainly in all of the ones that I read is what's going to be challenging is finding people in science, technology, engineering, and math is going to be really difficult, and it's going to be increasingly difficult. We're going to have shortages in IT, your IT staff. Some of those areas in the country are going to be so tough that those positions can be impossible to fill. So we may need to start looking at other ways to actually, whether it be outsourcing, how do we really find those particular people to fill that void. Certainly something else that's really happening is Harvard has this great website called The Next Generation of Teachers, where they study what's changing about the teaching workforce. And what they're saying is that the next generation is not going to be anything like the teachers in our school right now, is that people entering teaching right now are not looking at it as a lifelong career. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. That many teachers are now entering teaching late in their careers, having been in other fields. And most importantly, there are many things that those entering the teaching workforce, they find unappealing about teaching. They feel that it's professionally isolating. Many schools have standardized pay, which is unappealing to them. And they also don't feel like they have opportunities for influence and advancement. So, understanding how you're putting into place programs that are really going to both recruit and retain your teaching staff is going to be more important than ever. So, understanding that you're funding those components and you're supporting the head of school and developing a program is going to be huge. The other thing that's going to be interesting is that millennials will continue to grow in number. By 2020, they're going to be the majority in the workforce, and they certainly have a different way of working than the generations before them. So understanding what that's going to mean, how that's going to force changes is certainly, again, something that a board should be aware of and following those trends. And finally, it's never been more important for you to understand that your own board is running like a well-oiled machine. So hopefully you're all doing board assessments. This happens to be NAIS's, and it looks at board functioning in a lot of different ways, but what's important about this is you can benchmark it with all the other boards that have done this to really understand how well you're functioning, to see where you stand out. And we certainly look at these to see, what are the trends. And, the one areas that, and heads and board chairs alike say that fundraising is an area that is probably their weakest link. But there's some other areas, and it can certainly benchmarking this can help you to understand how you grow as a board. And finally, this is a really easy thing to do, and I think it's a great exercise for any board, is these factors are those things that generally a school board would be responsible for. So going through an exercise where you look at how important do you think each of these factors are to the healthy functioning of your board, and then to do a self-rating of how well you think you do this, and then to look at a gap analysis to really identify where your board really needs to do work. And we did this across the board in this particular survey, and you can see some of the areas that stood out in the improvement opportunities was fundraising, not enough diversity on the board, boards not really being community ambassadors. So this is a quick and easy thing to do, but it certainly gives you a really good way to understand where the board needs to grow. And finally, and then we just have a few minutes for questions. I wanted to leave you with this quote, which is one of my favorites, because I think sometimes when we're really close to our work and what we know about the school, it somewhat gives us cataracts. And so getting this information, gathering the context can really help you to understand and view the world differently. And many of us have heard about the importance of generative boards. And what generative boards do is they start to look at this information and have conversations where they make sense of the circumstances. And that can be one of the most powerful ways for boards to really lead schools in the world ahead. So, what is item number 42? Let me go back.
That was item 4, look with a question mark.
Oh, item 4. Item 4 on this slide. I can't really tell from, let's see, what is item number 4?
Maybe Andrew could turn on his mic and he could just ask you.
Okay.
Unmute my audio. There you go. I was just wondering, everything seemed to switch from item number 3 in your presentation to number 5, and all of a sudden I was like, what happened to number 4? And I was engrossed in the topic and didn't know that we changed from one point to another, so I just wanted to make sure that I had that right transition. So number 3 was economic trends, and then
okay. You're talking about the trends overall.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I can go back, and I'm going to give you this whole presentation, but you know, it might have been I think it was consumer trends that we covered after economic trends.
Got it. That's perfect. Thank you. That's what I thought it was. So it's consumer kind of trends and behavior.
Right. Yeah. And I always kind of look at those as both the supply and the demand side, is that, you know, it's great to count the number of kids, but just keeping on track of all of these changing behaviors in consumers is really tough. And, you know, I didn't mention this today, but another item that I'm a huge fan of, and I think it's a great way to get information, is for a school to do a brand valuation study.
Oh, that sounds great.
And, you know, basically what you do in a brand valuation study is you look at a series of questions which you ask to your current parents. You look at those families who were invited into the school, and then your whole inquiry pool. So.
You know, while my mic's unmuted, could I ask a quick question, if that's okay?
Sure.
In terms of one of the things that I think that our board should really consider is, you think about changes, and change right now is being driven by technology. And different schools in New York City, some completely embrace technology, some completely don't. I think what we're going to try to do, is try to go to a middle ground. But in terms of benchmarking and uses of technology, in terms of just how the board, and it's really going to be the board's responsibility to try to get their arms around it. I think just benchmarking different schools and how they've used technology in positive ways and how they've used technology where it's led to not so positive things.
Right.
I think that's going to be such a critical thing, because if you don't deal with it now, in 5 years, you're going to be so far behind. You know, talk about your brand. Your brand could be destroyed if you're just completely, if you're completely kind of just ambivalent towards what's happening in terms of technology and learning.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, we are actually going to be launching a center around this, and and certainly sharing a lot of case studies. And but technology is one of those things, as you all well know, you have to be careful about it not being the tail wagging the dog. And it's more about what is it that you want to do, and how can technology help you to get there. Certainly a conversation that many schools are having is, how can technology be used to cut down on some of the salary budget? Is, do we have to have all of our teaching done face-to-face? And I mean, that's a tough conversation to have, because you have to find, the right middle ground, and, and what's right for you and what's right for your community. And, but, I think certainly every board needs to be looking at rising tuitions and saying, at what price. I think sometimes, and particularly I think this can be the case in New York, when you have people that are willing to pay, you think it's just never going to stop. But you know, we actually have seen families, all of a sudden an entire community hit the wall. And, you know, and the other thing that we're seeing a rise in is a new kind of school that is using technology to really keep the price point down. I went to a open house last week for a series of for-profit schools that have done quite well in Canada, and they're making their mark in the U.S. And they are going to keep their schools below $15,000 by using technology differently, and also not investing very heavily in facilities. They're going to try to use the community. So, you know, these are the kinds of things I think, you know, one of the trends I didn't talk about is just this rise of lower cost schools who are pumping all the money into academics by using technology and cutting out on other kinds of frills. So I think it's great to have these kinds of conversations, and we will definitely be developing a lot of these case studies for you to share.
Well, Donna, thank you so much. I think that's a great way to end, and I love the thought that NAIS is, again, ahead of the curve on thinking about these issues, and I look forward to that. I want to thank everybody for participating in this session, and remind everyone that the recording of this talk will be available to you. We'll be making that available on our website. I'll send you a link to that, as well as the actual slideshow presentation that Donna put together for your use with your board, with your community, just for yourself. And I would also really like to thank you, Donna, for doing an exceptional job and sharing all of your wisdom with us. And don't be surprised if we invite you back for another one of these. So